For this chapter, we're going to look at how to UV map a multiple subset model. Now this is definitely my preferred way to work, as I get to create one high-res texture per object that makes up my model. Now this gives me a lot of flexibility in resolutions, both for the model and for the textures. Though typically the goal in low poly modeling is to get as much detail out of as few polys as possible, there are times when maybe for production art or pre-rendered animations that you want a higher poly count and higher resolution textures. We can, even at this stage in our model, we can plan for that and allow for that later by creating our model and textures in such a way that we can raise or lower resolutions with the minimum amount of work. For instance, as far as the model goes, using some advanced modeling techniques, which we will cover in the Advanced Modeling Techniques course, I can easily make this model into a much higher resolution, much higher poly count model that I can use in my production art. However, for now, I'm going to delete anything that can end up being mirrored. In other words, that whole right wing does not need to be there right now, because this left wing, after I've textured it, can just be mirrored onto the other side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate down and I'm going to unglue every major piece that makes up this model and work with them on an individual basis. I just find that easier so that as we get to each piece I don't have to navigate down through my hierarchy. So, making sure that everything is colored a nice plain white so that it shows up really nice against our UV editor, we're going to start. The first thing we have to do is we have to think about optimizations. By optimizations I mean this wing. The top of this wing is pretty much going to look exactly the same as the bottom. So for an object of that type, I can apply my UV mapping to just the top. I'm going to go in, check my editor. To me that's kind of upside down. So let's spin that around. Make sure it's nice and square. Now you can see it only shows the wing as one object here, and this is actually the top and the bottom being projected perfectly flat. So when I go in and I paint a texture onto this wing, the top and the bottom are going to look exactly the same. They're going to be mirrored from each other. That's a big optimization. I only have to texture the wing once. So I'm going to save this out to my textures directory. Let's call this wing. And that is now a 512 by 512 bitmap saved in that directory. I can now take that bitmap of this wireframe into a photo editor and start painting on it. And 512 by 512 is a pretty good resolution. That's fairly high res. This fuselage can be done the same way. If the top and the bottom are going to look pretty much the same when I'm done, I really only have to apply the UV projection to just the top. And you'll see when I open my editor, it projected that whole fuselage as just one flat image, which I can save out as fuselage as a nice 512 by 512 bitmap. Keeping in mind this whole philosophy of optimizations, I now have to think about certain really key sections like this nose cone. I can just take the mirrored approach. I can apply UV projection to the side, in which case the left side will mirror the right side. But this is a little bit inflexible, as you can see how it's nice and flat. This means that if I want to put a number or wording or something like that, when it gets mirrored onto the other side, it's going to be a mirror image. It's going to look backwards to someone looking at it. So if I do use this technique, I have to be very careful that I create a texture that, when mirrored, is not going to look funny. Now there's a couple different things I can do. I can take my point editing tools, grab just the whole one side, and use my color method to paint that one side automatically a certain color. So now, when I apply UV projection to those faces and open up my editor, I can navigate down my hierarchy and just save out the left side, nose left side, go in and repeat on the right side. Now what I've done is I have two separate image files. I can do the left side and the right side separately. In our next chapter, In our next chapter, when we actually go into a photo editor and start painting these, you'll see how we can plan our layers and our image files that we're working with within the photo editor to plan for things like needing to mirror very quickly and very easily to be very precise so that everything lines up properly and it all looks very, very sharp and very detailed and good once we bring it back into GameSpace and start painting this model. Now I could have also done the top and the bottom separately using that same technique. It all depends on how you want to do it. What you feel is going to make the best use of your texture space once we actually create one single skin file, and how far ahead you're thinking with your optimizations. Now, this will all become very obvious when we actually bring our skin back into GameSpace and begin the final mapping process in the last chapter of this section. Every major piece, from the fins to the fuselage, will require us to make these kind of decisions. We certainly should optimize where we can, but we also need to consider precision and if our shortcuts will make the final product look sloppy, or if it will allow for a better looking model and better looking skin by strategically reusing skin sections where we can. Like I said, the pieces to this will really fall into place over the next 2 chapters. Once all the major pieces are saved out as wireframes, we're ready to start painting.